In this film, we shall highlight the effects of viscoelasticity on flow characteristics. As we shall see, these can often be quite dramatic. Most liquids of reasonable consistency can be assumed to possess a certain level of viscoelasticity. This is usually quantified in the first instance by considering the behavior of the liquids of interest in simple rheometrical flows. So, for example, in a steady simple shear flow, normal stress differences are in evidence. These are absent in the case of Newtonian liquids. Furthermore, the viscosity is not usually constant, but a function of shear rate, with so-called shear thinning by far the most common expression of non-Newtonian behavior. In some ways, extravagant viscoelastic effects can be demonstrated in basic rheometrical flows, such as steady simple shear flow and uniaxial extension. Indeed, the rod-climbing Weissenberg effect, associated with normal stress effects in shear flow, is a classic example of what we have in mind. We have purposely decided not to go over old ground in the present film, and we simply show explanatory clips here, referring the viewer to the relevant Institute of Non-Newtonian Fluid Mechanics film. The blue liquid is Newtonian and the red liquid is viscoelastic. In general, when we seek to compare the behavior of non-Newtonian liquids with that of Newtonian liquids of comparable viscosity, we are faced with a problem. The variation of viscosity with shear rate makes it very difficult to isolate the effects of viscoelasticity on flow characteristics. This has been one of the main reasons for the widespread use of so-called Boga fluids, which was studied in detail in an earlier Institute of Non-Newtonian Fluid Mechanics film. Boga fluids are most notable for the fact that they have a constant shear viscosity, although often possessing a high level of viscoelasticity. Interestingly, many of the sequences we shall show in the current film are for Boga fluids. The other rheometrical function that immediately springs to mind is the so-called extensional viscosity. As usually defined, this is 3 times the shear viscosity in the case of Newtonian liquids. For non-Newtonian highly elastic liquids, the ratio of the 2 viscosities can be very high indeed. This difference is often seen as the major reason for the dramatic differences in response between Newtonian and elastic liquids. The classic open siphon effect associated with extensional flows was also discussed in one of the earlier films. The short clip shown here highlighting one of the most dramatic sequences. As the pictures from the Boga and Walters Rheological Phenomena in Focus book illustrate, there are many other expressions of the fascinating open siphon phenomenon, and we show a video of one such from the MIT laboratory of Professor Gareth McKinley for a dilute solution of polystyrene in a Newtonian solvent. Once the liquid is attached to the rotating drum, the container is slowly emptied of its contents. From published research, the final sequence showing radial motion is not unexpected. It is well known that elastic liquids, when deformed, can show either viscous or elastic behavior depending on the timescale of the deformation process, and rheologists often use changes in the Deborah number to explain the different behaviors. High Deborah numbers correspond to solid-like behavior, and low Deborah numbers to liquid-like behavior. So, for example, the silicone in the movie behaves like a liquid as it slowly finds its own level when placed in a container. On the other hand, A sphere of the same material is seen to bounce from a solid surface, in very much the same way as a rubber ball would behave. The high-speed video clip, in this case, is slowed down and includes a side view and also one taken from below the solid surface. Another experiment for demonstrating solid-like behavior in a mobile liquid was made popular many years ago by the late Professor Arthur Lodge, and his classic set of still pictures have often been reproduced. Here we show the phenomenon when a cantilever spring is raised, and the elastic liquid attached to it is abruptly cut. The elastic recoil is clearly evident. The recoil is quite dramatic and deserves a more detailed observation. In more complicated three-dimensional situations, secondary flows are in evidence. In the Newtonian case, these are driven by fluid inertia, but viscoelasticity can have a dramatic effect on the form, strength, and even direction of these secondary flows. Loosely, one might say that fluid inertia and viscoelasticity are often opposing influences in these situations. Rheologists at the University of Melbourne have produced an extensive collection of helpful videos on the subject, but because of time constraints, we are only able to show a subset in the present film, and we have purposely chosen sequences that highlight the opposing influences of inertia and viscoelasticity. In the Melbourne experiments, a torsional-driven cavity is used to generate a swirling flow in a well-defined geometry. The test fluid is situated within a fully enclosed cylinder where the top lid and side walls are stationary. A laser sheet is used to visualize the secondary flow patterns by inserting fluorescent dye into the flow cell through the top lid. The direction and behavior of the secondary flow field depends upon the properties of the fluid and on the balance between the inertial, viscous, and elastic forces. We see that the secondary flow at low Reynolds numbers for a Newtonian fluid is directed radially outwards along the bottom rotating disc, up the side walls, in along the top stationary lid, and down the central axis. We now see the reverse flow, which occurs in a xanthan gum-based boga fluid when elastic forces dominate. So, for example, the flow now comes in at the rotating disc, up the central axis, out at the top lid, and down the vertical wall. Clearly, in this viscoelastic case, the flow pattern is completely opposite to that for the Newtonian fluid. Interestingly, the so-called axis-symmetric vortex breakdown, which occurs as the Reynolds number is increased in all fluids, is, if anything, more dramatic in the Newtonian case. So we conclude this section with a brief glimpse of an extravagant effect in a Newtonian fluid. We see that recirculation regions occur along the central vortex core. The lower recirculation zone is very weak compared to the upper recirculation zone. The recirculation regions grow in size as the Reynolds number is raised. And the final close-up shows the distinctive features of the breakdown regions, which are joined to form a single structure. Sometimes extravagant viscoelastic effects are in evidence even when the apparent level of viscoelasticity is very low. So, for example, a very dilute solution of a high molecular weight polymer with a concentration as low as 10 parts per million can sometimes show dramatically different behavior from that of the solvent, even though the shear viscosity of the polymer solution is hardly affected by the addition of the polymer. The increased flow rate in the so-called turbulent drag reduction phenomenon is a very well-known example of what we are referring to. But in the present film, we shall concentrate on the splashing experiment, which has fascinated scientists ever since the pioneering work of Worthington over a century ago. Dropping a solid object onto the free surface of a liquid can often result in a rich sequence of events, including a crown structure, satellite drops, and a vertical jet. Here, we want to concentrate on the vertical jet, which sometimes reaches extravagant heights in the case of Newtonian liquids. In the first sequence, we show that this height is dramatically reduced when the polymer concentrations, as low as 10 parts per million, are added to the Newtonian solvent. Here, the polymer is polyacrylamide. The stills for Newtonian and Boga fluids of the same shear viscosity falling under identical conditions tell the same story. In a search for the 2D equivalent of the splashing experiment, we inadvertently came across a fascinating flow structure. The rods that were dropped horizontally onto the surface of the liquid were too short to produce the desired 2D flow. Instead, a visually attractive flow structure developed at right angles to the rod. We see what happens when 10 parts per million of the flexible polyacrylamide molecule and also 10 parts per million of the more rigid xanthan gum molecule were added to the Newtonian solvent in the short rod experiment. The changes are clear to see and are more prominent in the case of the polyacrylamide solution. It is clear that the effect of the polymer addition is not as marked in the short rod experiments as it is in the sphere case. Nevertheless, it is still evident and is seen to be more significant in the case of the polyacrylamide solution. So splashing is an obvious example of a situation where a seemingly small level of viscoelasticity can lead to an extravagant difference in the flow. Similarly, the addition of parts per million of polymer to a liquid drop can also have dramatic effects when impacting on a surface. In the sequences provided, we simultaneously observe a side view and one taken from above. The sequences illustrate two fluid droplets of identical viscosity impinging upon a hydrophobic surface developed to mimic the surface of a plant leaf. In the left-hand sequence, the fluid without polymer impacts on the surface, forms a drop which effectively leaves the surface, whilst the sequence on the right illustrates the drop impact with almost no bouncing away from the surface. Clearly, in the delivery of an agricultural chemical to a leaf, the phenomenon in the right-hand sequence is preferred. Here is a good example of how important viscoelasticity can be in a practical application, like the delivery of a water-based agricultural chemical to the surface of a plant. One of the most important developments in recent years in the consistent measurement of the uniaxial extensional viscosity for mobile liquids has been the introduction of the so-called filament stretching rheometer. In this, the test liquid is placed between two surfaces, which are then separated exponentially. The flow often generates features that are significantly modified by, and sometimes dominated by, viscoelasticity. We shall show some sequences made available to us by Professor Gareth McKinley of MIT. The first sequence is for a very low viscosity fluid consisting of the common drag-reducing polymer polyethylene oxide dissolved in water. The sample is initially held between the plates by surface tension. Since the timescale is of the order of 20 milliseconds, the use of a high-speed video camera is essential. The ratio of the gap between the plates to the plate radius is initially of order unity, and the plates are then separated at an exponentially increasing rate. Here the fascinating sequence shows breakup when viscoelasticity, inertia and surface tension are all important. Inertia leads to the top-bottom asymmetry. Surface tension drives the breakup process into spherical bead-like droplets. However, these are interconnected by thin filaments or ligaments in which viscoelastic extension of polymer molecules dominates the dynamics. The second film shows the filament stretching rheometer with a small initial gap, operating in its normal mode, with a very viscous fluid, in this case a polystyrene-based Boga fluid. Here, we see an example of the so-called adhesive end-plate instability. In this sequence, we see the end-plate instability using a filament stretching rheometer with a special end plate, which again permits us to view from both the side and from below. There is no doubt that flow instabilities can be dramatically affected by viscoelasticity. Of course, in some notable circumstances, important instabilities can occur even in Newtonian liquids. The transition to turbulence in pipe flow and the extrusion instability known as draw resonance are two obvious examples. These require the flow to reach a critical strength before setting in. So, for example, one talks of the critical Reynolds number at the onset of turbulence. Having said that, there is no doubt that elastic liquids provide a far richer range of instabilities, many of which are not found in the Newtonian case. Indeed, some of these instabilities are viscoelasticity dominated and can occur even when the Reynolds number is vanishingly small. Extrusion of an elastic liquid from a capillary can generate a fascinating collection of instabilities, ranging from striping to shark skin to melt fracture, and various combinations of these. We will show some typical examples taken from the book Rheological Phenomena in Focus, and originating from the rheology laboratory of Professor Jean-Michel Piot at the Joseph Fourier University in Grenoble, France. Striping, when it occurs, is usually the forerunner to later more dramatic instabilities, and we see a typical example of striping for a branched silicon. The next sequence is for increasing flow rates in a branched silicon gum flowing from a cylindrical profiled orifice. So-called shark skin is present in B and melt fracture in D. C is essentially a superposition of the two phenomena. Movies of these instabilities can often be visually attractive, and we show a fascinating instability for a Seb's block copolymer being extruded through a 5 mm diameter die. This was again obtained at the Grenoble laboratory. Interestingly, when the flow rate is increased by a factor of 10 in this particular case, slipping occurs, which reduces the stresses, and consequently the extradate seems to be nearly defect-free. In this film, there has been time for a showing of only a subset of the available extravagant viscoelastic phenomena. However, for completeness, and in conclusion, we show stills of some of the other examples we might have included given more time.